And Wendy, could you just give us a quick, introduce us to Tani?
Sure, I would love to. So hi, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. I want to reintroduce you to Tani Prell, for whom this is maybe the third or fourth appearance at Macomb Solal Lakeside. Tani is a dear friend of mine and also a co-trustee for the URJ's North American Board. She is very active front and center in RAC, Illinois, and has done a lot of the READY work, the racial equity, diversity, and inclusion work as part of the RAC. So we're thrilled to have her here. So with that, I'm going to turn it right over to you, Tani. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. I'm always so happy to be here with all of you. Thank you for having me. And oh my gosh, there's so much that we have to dive into with this book. Like, I feel like we could probably have like 10 hours, a whole like brunch afternoon to discuss, but I'm excited for our hour that we have ahead. And so, well, I know some of you, I would love to just like start us out with, if you could just share your name, your pronouns, I can refer to you as respectfully as possible. And then if you could share one word or a sentence about how you feel after reading the book. And perhaps you haven't finished the book, perhaps you have yet to read the book, and that's okay. Then please share a word for how you're feeling tonight. So there's quite a few. So let's do one word. So I'm Tani Prell. I use she, her pronouns, and I feel very raw after reading it. It's a lot. And I will pass it to Diane, and then Diane, you can pass it to somebody.
I use she, her. It was a tough thing to read, and I got a lot of questions too later on. So yeah, yep. I will pass it to Julie.
Hi, everybody, and hi, Tani. I'm Julie Webb, she, hers, and I guess I feel disturbed, and I will pass it to James.
Okay, well, good evening. I'm Jim Schuster, he, him, his. I guess if I had to have one word for reading Caste, I'd say kind of enlightened. I didn't agree with everything I read, but there was so much perspective that I had never, I guess, perhaps seen quite that way and gained some understanding of. So I guess that's where I would go with it. Amy?
Hi, I'm Amy Plotnick, she, hers, and I have not finished the book, but I also find it so many aspects disturbing, just frightening. And I will pass it to, oh my goodness, I don't see the people in the gallery. Who's out there? Oh, Evie. I'll pass it to Evie.
Can you hear me? I'm Evie Horwich. In full disclosure, I feel relatively uninformed. I read the book when it first came out, and I was really quizzical because Zoom was just starting, and I noticed it on everybody's bookshelf, and I said, okay, I've got to get this book. I realized how uninformed I was as I read it, and I didn't even notice this until today and realized, oh, you know, I never did finish it, and I just kind of pulled it back off my bookshelf and realized that I really need to re-educate myself. And I just felt that it was such an important book as I was reading it at the time. And I kept mentioning it to the few people that I did see, or, I mean, that was the first thing that came out of my mouth. Oh, I'm reading Caste, you've got to read it. But I have not finished it. And now I, plan to. So I'm really interested to hear what everybody else has to say. But I realized how ignorant I didn't realize I was, and really kind of struck by, some of the things that she brought out. But I loved the first book, which is one of the things that geared me to it. Her Warmth of Other Suns, which I read, many years ago. So that's what I have to say.
I'll jump in, Evie. It's Rabbi Ike, and I actually am still working my way through it too. But I just want to say it feels a little bit like when I'm nearsighted. When I got my first pair of glasses, it's like things that you sort of dimly see come into focus in a way that they never had before. So, Michael, how about you? You haven't said anything yet.
Hey, hi, Michael Tatel, he, him. I guess I read not the whole book, but parts of the book, and I think I just come away sad for the country. Sad for what people have gone through and are continuing to experience. And let's see, who's Susan?
Okay, well, Jim, you stole my word of enlightenment. So I'm going to say educated. I thought I knew a lot about the situation of these people, but I guess I didn't know as much as I should. And I read the whole book, and I think it's a must read for everybody. I will pass it to Vanessa.
I feel bad that I have to say this, but I was a little surprised to keep reading and reading story after story after story. And it is a must read. And I'm so glad we're all here today. And I pass it to Sandy and Mark.
I'm Sandy Simon. I read the book. I read the first book that Isabel wrote. I was very impressed with the way she's able to articulate the concepts and draw the information together. And I've been thinking about it and talking about it a lot.
I haven't read the book yet.
Well, we have 50 minutes to convince you to read the book. Alan.
I have only read about 70 pages so far, so obviously I have many more stories to go through. The thing that surprises me the most, and it wasn't starting to read the book, but when my son read the book and told me about it, is that I never thought of the use of the word caste in this experience. So that's a real eye opener. If I wanted to make a pun, I would say it cast a new light on things.
Sue, you just joined. We're talking about how we feel about the book. If you'd like to go. Let me see if I can unmute you. Yep, you're unmuted. Go ahead, just talk.
Am I muted?
Nope, I can hear you.
Okay. I don't know. You know what? I'm just joining, so I'll just see where we are.
Okay, all right. Gail, did you want to say anything? Or Rosalind? And I think that's everybody. Oh, Rosalind, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay, this is Gail. Can you hear me?
Yes, Gail, go.
Okay, good. I did read the whole book, every word. And the one thing that struck me was the caste system, according to Hitler, was what he looked at to form his opinion of how to get rid of the Jews. The way we treated the blacks in this country, a long time ago, Civil War, pre-Civil War, was what he based what he wanted to do against the Jewish population in Germany. Did everybody else pick that up? Because that really hit me. And to me, that was the most important thing I read in the book.
Wendy, did you have?
Yeah, no, I didn't have a chance. So.
Oh, Wendy.
No worries. I read the book right after it came out, so I'm so thrilled to be here today. it was very powerful. And I found that her framework, just this whole caste construct, to be fascinating, very sad, very depressing. What Gail mentioned struck me right away, that the quote unquote success of how Americans had handled the slaves was a model of success for what he wanted to use in Germany. I just, it was a fascinating and very powerful book. And I'm so happy Tani's here to process it with us.
So now I think we have everybody. Tani, I always like to start off the book groups. I'm just looking at, what does Isabel look like? She's, you know, a beautiful woman. She's done so much. There she is with President Obama, getting awards. So it just, we can picture her in our mind.
For some of the stories that she shares about herself, to be able to kind of visualize it with that. But yeah, thank you for sharing, Vanessa, and thank you all for sharing your initial kind of one word about how you're feeling about it. And like from sad to enlightened to surprised, like all of those are like very, whatever you felt reading it, like that is very valid. There was so much there. And for those who are still in the process of reading it, that is all good. I'm sure we can all be part of the conversation together. And if you do need a refresher, I am going to share a little summary for those who that would be helpful for, especially if you have not read it. And Isabel Wilkerson, just as a little kind of grounding in our amazing author. So she has the National Humanities Medal and has become a leading figure in narrative fiction, an interpreter of human condition, and an impassioned voice for demonstrating how history can help us understand ourselves, our country, and our current era of upheaval. That's a nice little bio from Goodreads. And that's something that many of you mentioned as well, just the relevance for our world that we're living in today, and seeing this thread throughout history and how we've gotten to the reality that we're in currently. And there's so much for us to process. We gave one word, and now that you've gotten to hear from other people and you're thinking about your process of reading it, I would love for us to kind of create a collective source of everything that we're thinking about with this book. So I'm going to drop a link to a Google Doc, and would love for you to please go into this Google Doc and just have this be your collection of any thoughts about this book. So after you've read it, this could be, what stories did Isabel Wilkerson share that really landed with you in particular? If there was like a particular story that she shared throughout history, is there a significant historical moment that really still is landing with you that you've been thinking about after reading it? The things, people who said that they were disturbed or saddened, what was it about the book that made you feel that way? And we're going to collect that here. And then if you scroll down a little bit, what questions does this book raise for you? And are there questions about this book that you would really love to ask this wonderful group of people as a whole, and would help you process the book as well? So we'll take one song. The wonderful Vanessa has the song queued up for us. So thank you, Vanessa. And so we'll take just a few minutes. Just any thoughts that you have about the book, please share them in the Google Doc.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen so I can make sure I share the sound. And
Thank you.
oh no, that's the wrong one. But wait, I'll get it. I'll get it.
I believe.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Vanessa. As we go, please feel free, as things are like landing for you, to add that to the Google Doc, and as questions arise as well. And the song that was playing, that was the instrumental of Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday, about the horrors of lynching. And it felt like a very full circle song for us, because it was actually written by a man named Abel Meerpool, who was a Jewish school teacher. And he said, I hate injustice, I hate lynching. And so he wrote it as a poem first, and then put music to it, and then brought it to Billie Holiday. And Billie Holiday listened to it, and she was like, oh my goodness, this song feels like it really tells a story of my dad. And her dad wasn't lynched, but he did have, he was exposed to mustard gas during World War I and had all these lung complications, but he wasn't ever able to get medical access, the right medical access, because so many of the hospitals that could treat him were for whites only. And so he ended up dying of those lung complications. And so for Billie Holiday, it really felt like it was a sort of lynching that her father experienced. So the fact that it was written by a Jewish man, and played by a Black woman, feels very full circle for the book that we read together. And thank you for sharing your thoughts in the Google Doc. And one of the things I think is really great for us to start with is just the comparison that happened within Black people in America, with slavery throughout, and then post-slavery, with Nazi Germany, and then in India. And so were there any within those similarities and comparisons, and within the book in general, what were some of the things that were most surprising to you, that maybe you didn't know coming into the book, that was surprising, especially in those three comparisons? And we can try it with just like unmuting, and then if we need to do raised hands, we can go into that.
I think the way Isabel used caste throughout the book consistently, and the repetition of it really made me, it opened my eyes. And without that repetition, I don't know how, it really sunk in that way. Wendy?
The framework really worked for me. The casts across the three groups, it was very eye-opening and also very logical, sadly logical.
Yeah, I think that framework worked incredibly well. Can anyone imagine what would have possibly been lost if she chose to only focus on the caste system within a lens of America, without these other references of Nazi Germany or India? Or what about that framework to you made it so powerful? Julie?
Well, I think that the fact, again, it's, I forget who it was that just shared this, but the fact that the Nazis actually based, their system on our system, whether it's, our systemic situation that is this really added, it sort of took the fact, it's sort of like when you think of the Holocaust, it's a short period of time, relatively, 4-6 years, whatever you want to call it. But it sort of feels like this is like a long-term version of that. And the contrast of that came through. And I think that would have been a miss. I don't think I could have conceptualized it nearly as powerfully and clearly, I think.
Absolutely. How when reading those comparisons to slavery and Nazi Germany, what feelings did that bring up for people? What were some of your reactions when reading that in particular? Oh, and Rabbi Ike, thank you for the additional knowledge. That's so good.
I didn't know whether to put that out there or not, but I just think it's such an interesting piece of the biography of the poet. So.
Thank you.
And linking it back to the Rosenbergs is also. The other thing that grabbed me, and Gail said at the beginning that the reference to the Nazis, obviously we as Jews, I can relate to that, but when the Nazis said what America did went too far, that's when I was like, yikes. So to look at, whether it's Jim Crow laws, all the things that they talked about, and the Nazis thought, well, we're going to take this system and make it better. That was eye-opening.
I guess I ought to add that the other thing that Hitler said was he didn't just borrow ideas about how we treated the Black community, which he assuredly drew some lessons from. And as one who has taught and works the Holocaust way too much, those comparisons don't sit well with me, generally speaking. But the other thing that Hitler did cite is that he took as much from our treatment of Native Americans as he did from our treatment of Blacks. So I guess what he was latching onto in the American psyche was has a couple of different dimensions and aspects to it.
Yeah, and I think, well, and Wilkerson brings that up as well, like talk about a mass genocide of a group of people, and calling back to that reference as well. Thank you for that, James. Susan? Oh, you're muted, Susan.
One of the things that I kept being reminded of the whole time I was reading this book is that there, unfortunately, in so many societies, and ours also, the only way people feel important themselves is if they have somebody underneath them that they feel is lower than they are. So it's like, and it pervades itself through the entire society, and not just in this country, but she pointed out, in so many others as well. But it's not very good here.
Yeah, that's a great point, Susan. And Julie, and then Susan, let's go back to something that you just brought up. Julie?
Another interesting thing about the book, and I'm just going to compare it. I mean, years ago when our kids were little, and my daughter's 29 now, so we went to the Nature Museum right when it opened up, and there was an exhibit there on race genetically, and the exhibit was about how race wasn't real, like there wasn't a biological thing. It was like, how it was a social construct. And when I first saw that exhibit, I was like, it doesn't even make sense. What do you mean? Like, look around, it's, real. And then all the way from then till now, I've read this over and over and over, how race isn't real. It's socially constructed for social purposes. And it's still shocking to read this in the book and to catch myself going, well, wait a minute, that, it just really demonstrated to me how deeply sown truths that aren't true are, even when we're actively really trying to work on moving forward. I feel like, it's barely getting back to square one just every time almost.
Yeah, Julie, bring up such a good point with that it is so, race is just, the implications of it are so real that like the idea of unlearning that it is a construct it's a lot, and it takes an unlearning of many, many levels of the way that we've just been conditioned to go through our society. And I think one of the things that Wilkerson did that really kind of amplified the way that race functions here in particular was when she referenced one of the a young man who was like a doctor in Nigeria and came to the United States, and someone to him was like, "Oh, you speak so good English." And he's like, "Of course I speak good English. Like I speak multiple languages." And that like in his that to be one thing in your country, but to come here and just be Black, and the multiple examples of that came up. And I want to, Susan, raise up your point that you brought up about this idea that people are all over, very the need to put people down in order to remain on top. And that reminded me in the book how Wilkerson brought up how many people end up voting against their own interests to be able to maintain a certain power dynamic. And so I was wondering for all of you, what are some kind of present day examples that you are seeing that relate to the book? What in Caste do you see playing out in your day-to-day lives or in the country in general? Or examples that she gave that really stuck out to you? Yeah, Susan.
Well, what you just said about people voting against their own best interests, I think we're seeing this all the time right now with people. It seems that I don't like to bring our politics into this discussion, but it's there. And we see who are the biggest, say, Trump voters, are the people who have the most to lose by voting that way. But because of the bigotry and all the other things that they seem to want to promote, they vote against their own best interests and they don't even realize they're doing it.
Thank you, Susan. James?
I mean, the other example in today's world that jumps at me is the whole issue of things like masking and vaccination. And the people who, and I'm not here to judge this crowd and what people did or didn't do necessarily, but the people who will do things that clearly are against their own health interest for other reasons, valid or not. The woman in today's, I think it was today's Tribune, if not it was yesterday, an article about a woman boasting about how the more people try to tell her she has to mask, the more she's going to not, just on principle, regardless of whether it's good or bad idea.
Yeah, thank you, James. That's another, really great example of that. Evie?
Yeah, I'm just going to throw this out there because I've been wondering about this. If maybe one of the benefits that we've had of these past couple of years is maybe we would be a little bit more colorblind, because all we are seeing is people who wear masks or don't wear masks, and we kind of somehow blend ourselves into two groups, and a little less discerning of race or anything else that we might have. And it just reminds me of a scenario that I had, when I was a very young college graduate. I graduated very young, and it was my first teaching job, and it was at I was the only non-African American person in the building, and I had a very dark suntan, and my hair is normally very kinky. And it wasn't until I started to see a couple of parents that the kids didn't know that I was not Black. And then they started to call me paleface. And then it ended up with, and I don't know if that was a racial thing or not, but one of the kids kicked me in the stomach, and it caused an emergency appendectomy that night, and I didn't go back. But it was not in my mind. It wasn't the racial issue that kept me. It was just, the safety in my situation at the time. But I just think that so much is dependent on facial recognition and other subliminal kinds of things. I'm wondering if the idea that we're all wearing masks might be just one benefit, hopefully.
Thank you for sharing your personal story, Evie. I would say that, and this was one of the things that Wilkerson did bring up in regards to the pandemic, was just that in so many ways it highlighted so many of the major discrepancies in lived experience between Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this country in terms of how COVID impacted them, with the Black and Latinx communities in particular facing the highest death rates. And so while covering our faces, it still was, the impacts of race were very much being felt and just amplified with COVID in so many ways, and continues to be in terms of layoffs as well, and what that did to wages also. Alan?
I don't want to be Pollyannish, but one thing I've observed, I have 4 now teenage grandchildren, 2 in Evanston, 2 who live in London, England. And they have all gone to schools which not only have Black and white, but people from all over the world. And at least in those experiences, those children do not seem to focus at all on the race or the ethnicity of the people who they're interacting with in school. I am concerned that as they get older, they may come under the influence of their parents or others who will wipe out that benefit. And not all children, certainly in the US, grow up in schools such as those where there's so much of a mixture of peoples. But I do think it's good, probably exemplified by my granddaughter, who's now 13, but when President Obama was elected, she insisted there had to have been a Black president before that. So maybe there's some hope with the young.
I'm always hopeful with that, Alan. I'm always hopeful with that. Thank you for sharing that. And I think one of the things that you exemplify, Alan, is the access, well, kind of 2 sides to this, an access to history in a very different way for many of our young people, that there is much more, like they have books like Caste to be able to access and have kind of highlighting the true history of what's happening, and what makes the conversation around critical race theory really, like this is like a very big conversation for us to be having in schools, to make sure that history is being able to be learned. Because for many of you, were the topics and themes in Caste, was that something that you learned in school growing up? Or kind of what was your experience with topics like this prior to reading Caste, or in education? In your educational experience, or was a lot of this new? Julie?
I grew up in a small rural town in Ohio. I mean, not only this book, but her first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, when I read that, which is about the Great Migration, I had never even heard of the Great Migration. I didn't even know what she was talking about for like the beginning of the book. And I finally went and Googled it just to see like, what is that? And then I mean, just the whole notion of so much of this was just not, it wasn't taught incorrectly, it was just zero. It was as if it never occurred at all. I mean, I've been stunned every year as I learn still new things, and I'm just like, how did I not know this? It's incredible.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Wendy?
So I'll date myself, but I didn't learn that. What I've learned about anti-racism and all, it was self-taught outside of school. I mean, even in college, I don't think there was any coursework that, well, Wilkerson didn't write this book all the way back when I was in college, but even then, you know, these kinds of narratives were not generally shared.
Yeah, thank you,
Uh,
Wendy.
I've just got to say, I grew up in Florida. My mother went to Robert E. Lee Middle School. So you can already sort of imagine what the education was like down there. And even when I was a kid. So, you know, it didn't change much. And there was a time when people were talking about school integration, but not much was happening, you know.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Ike. Amy? And then James.
I grew up in Palo Alto, California, and I felt like we were educated about this. And I was educated about this in my family of origin. This was something that my parents felt was very important for us to understand. So I feel like this has been stuff that I've known about my whole life.
Was Palo Alto, was that a diverse area?
It was, I mean, yes, I mean, it was a little bit segregated, but yet it was still diverse, only in the sense of African Americans and white, but and Asian as well also. So, you know, I just felt that very comfortable with the topics. They were not new to me.
That's great. That's great, Amy. I hope Palo Alto has continued to be at the forefront of this sort of education. James?
Well, I graduated from Highland Park High School, so I guess we know what kind of community I grew up in reasonably well. And it was civil rights and Vietnam era and so on. We talked about some of this. Certainly slavery was brought up in classes, or Reconstruction or whatever, although nothing like the detail or perspective that this brings to it and has been brought to the fore in recent years. But I think maybe in a way the biggest difference that strikes me is whatever we did talk about and were educated in was not personalized. It was much more of a general abstract concept. You could talk about slavery, but it wasn't about individual slaves and what that really translated into.
Jim, before you get off, you said at the beginning when we asked that there were some things you disagreed with, and I would just love to hear what that is. I can't let you off the hook.
No, that's fair. The problem is that I read the book long enough ago that I'm going to have real trouble giving you much of a specific answer on it. I remember when I read it, questioning whether some of the things were necessarily racial, the way they were being perceived, which doesn't make it any less significant or racial for her. But looking at some of the examples and thinking, I'm not sure that's the way that was meant, or that's the way it should be taken. It took me at least 2/3 or 3/4 of the book before I was willing to buy into the concept of the word caste in the first place. I've spent too many years correcting students and explaining that the caste system in India is not the class system in China or Europe or whatever. And the differences, and I buy the concept of caste at this point, I should add, but I spent a lot of time struggling with things like that. And some of those, what was really intended here as opposed to how was it taken. That's as best as I can remember. That's not a perfect answer for you, Vanessa, but.
And thank you for bringing up the personal stories. And did that play a role in the taking on of the term caste, having those personal stories connected to it?
For me, you mean?
Yeah. Yes.
No, I think the way it shaped society and where people fit in society, I developed a different appreciation for that. And where the caste system in India, for example, you're born into it, you're stuck. There's no movement, there's no change. That defines who you are. And the ability to define who you are and where you fit in society, I think she convinced me that that was more real and more widespread, perhaps, than I was giving credence to.
Amazing. Thank you. Susan?
Okay, so I think I may be the oldest person in attendance here. But I grew up in Chicago in the Rogers Park area. And I don't remember ever, oh darn. I don't remember, just a minute, excuse me. I picked it up and hung up and it was my son. At any rate, I don't remember ever hearing anything when I was in grade school regarding anything of this. But in high school, when we studied American history and the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln, the freeing of the slaves, and all that is when I really became aware. And prior to that, the only Black people I ever knew were the woman who cleaned house for my parents, the man who was the janitor at my father's store. He had a retail men's clothing store, but I didn't know any people, so it was when I was in high school that I really became aware.
Thank you, Susan. Say hi to your son for us. And I think that was one of the things that Wilkerson really did an amazing job with in this book. Because for me, for example, like when I was in school all the way to high school, it was always like slavery was like a moment in history, not this thing that has a thread throughout, and the fact that it went from slavery to Jim Crow, that there was a reason why we needed the civil rights movement, that string of events and the reason behind it was never made clear. And Wendy, like when you said like you had to seek it out, like the stringing together of these things is so often something that we have to do and seek on our own. And that was one of the things I think Wilkerson did a really lovely job with in this book. And Susan, to your point about not necessarily knowing any Black people, I think Wilkerson also did really showed the way that was an intentional part of the crafting of America, that Black people were only in certain roles for such a long time, and how to even walk on the same side of the street could get you killed for looking at someone the wrong way, and just the real life implications of being in proximity to whiteness and the need to physically put separation between people. And so when reflecting on our own histories and how often we have or have not been in proximity to people of color, kind of using Wilkerson's lens of like, well, why? Like what was it about where we lived? Were we living in an area that was redlined and intentionally kept Black people out, intentionally kept people of color out, or our education system? so many ways for us to think about that. And I know we have 10 minutes left. So in these 10 minutes, are there other parts of the book that are still bubbling up for you that you want to make sure we talk about? Pamela, hello.
Hi, I wanted to talk about, I went to Robert E. Lee Junior High, which is now Northwood Junior High in Montgomery County, Maryland. And, just how crazy is that? But, I mean, it's obviously just a different world now. And I just think it's interesting how, the renaming of schools and, the taking back. And then also, we haven't really talked too much about, the statues, how the statues were put around all around these southern cities to be so intimidating, and how, we're having trouble figuring out as a country really what to do about that.
Yeah, great point, Pamela. Did anyone have any thoughts about that section of the book where she talked about the monuments, and also that was a comparison that she also made to Berlin after, and just the really thoughtful ways that no monuments to be seen, and instead tributes to those who were lost. Vanessa?
So through this whole time, we've seen that a lot of those statues that are not from the time of the Civil War, they're from Jim Crow times, to make, weren't we just talking about how the Confederacy, this disillusionment, to make them feel better. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the one anecdote about the Black man who named his daughter Miss. Her first name was Miss Hale. And he knew that eventually she would get in trouble because this is 1970, a white person wouldn't want to call her Miss Hale. And what a risky thing to take on for your daughter. And I guess in a brave thing. I'm not sure where I understand. I don't know if I understand what he was trying to do. I mean, I understand, but that's a really risky thing to, make sure your daughter's going to be called out.
And kind of similar in some ways. I mean, I had a friend in high school whose name was Prince. Makes sense though, right?
Yeah, I remember I had a student whose name was King, and I was like, you know what? Your parents, really. I'm glad that they gave you that name. There's some power behind that.
It's really valuable, to self-image and things like that, I think, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Were there any other stories or anecdotes that you felt were really powerful in the book, or topics that you still want to elevate? Yeah, Pamela?
So I thought the whole idea about how Germany looks back on Nazism would be really amazing if our country could get to that point. And I'm not sure how we can, but I think that it's pretty remarkable, that the German people today have really kind of taken ownership of what happened. And I think somehow we have to get that mentality here. I think there seems to be a big gap in, it's very painful for part of our country to look back for some reason. And why do you think it happened easier in Germany and we're still struggling here?
I'm not sure it's done in Germany, to tell you the truth.
Right.
There's been some backsliding in recent years. It's maybe worth an addendum, in the next edition of the book, right? To see how these things, no matter what you do to eradicate them, they find their ways to seep back up.
But the government kind of, had a very different approach to it than our government.
Right, and that's true, but they're having the same issues as we have, that governments change. And who would have thought that the last administration would say some of the things they said out loud. You know, whatever people say behind, you know, we should have no illusions about what they said behind closed doors in the past, but, you know, what people said out loud is extraordinary, you know.
And Pamela, you raised an interesting question with that, just in terms of like, what do you all feel like it would take for us, for in America, to get to a point of recognizing our history and making that shift? Julie, and then if people want to reflect on that.
I think one thing I actually read about Germany, but also South Africa, really, as a country that got rid of a caste system, and not just a caste system, but, well, I guess laws are part of a caste system too, but and the whole idea of having that truth and reconciliation part, again, not that it's a stat that you're going to get there and nothing's ever going to change. That's one thing that I read on that question. The other thing I just wanted to share was, someone mentioned one of the sort of ideas that are sticking to them are the notion that somebody else has to be down for you to be up. And at the same time, I think that it's not just like that you want that you have to put them up. It is sort of this whole notion that there literally is an actual hierarchy. There is a, you know, that we actually are thinking there is a hierarchy, and that is actually part of people's worldview, and to challenge the most basic of people's belief systems. So I do think when people say other people are voting against their own interests, they might weigh a health cost or something as less important to them than maintaining their entire way of looking at the world. And I just thought that's another element to this, that is, we don't necessarily look at it like they do. And I mean, I'm not assuming everyone here is on the same page. I guess I should say, I don't necessarily look at it in that way, but it's an interesting thing to consider. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was when she brought up how it's like, oh, it's easy to like feel bad if like a person's in front of you and they start crying because like someone said this horrible thing, and then like when it's the collective, when it's an entire group, very different. James?
I think one of the challenges that we face in the issues in this country, as opposed to whether it be a Germany or a lot of other places, is the fact that in about 20, whatever it is, 23 years or something like that, the whites in this country will no longer be the majority. And there's an upending of the social order that implies and is coming, that so much of what was created was built to maintain that position of superiority, and it's being directly challenged. And we are, the comment I heard on, I think it was NPR, was we are the first quote unquote white, as you said, racist. That's a whole different issue with the validity of the word, but we are the first white country in the history of the world that is going to go through that transition. There's others that are going to follow. Canada and whatever, a bunch of other places aren't necessarily way behind us, but we're in front of it. And I think that's part of the challenge that we're facing here.
I might argue, Jim, that since race is just a construct, all we will do is we'll make some other people white, you know, which kind of already happened to the Jews. You know, and will happen to somebody else, you know, Hispanics, for example.
Yeah, how many forms do you fill out nowadays that ask what race you are and white or non-white Hispanic?
Yeah.
So I think you can see that. I think it's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Well,
the world will change, and maybe, you know, I mean, I don't know. I don't see how white people can still, it's just, we just have to accept that it is changing, and, you know, why does it have to be problematic, I guess is the true question.
I I think that what Caste really, of many things that it illuminates, is how deeply complex the world that we live in is. And I know it's 8 o'clock, and so I want to be appreciative of your time and respectful of your time. And I want to leave us with this one quote from the book that I think is especially relevant, and just that final line, that any of us manages to create abiding connections across these manufactured divisions is a testament to the beauty of the human spirit. And I hope we can lean into that amongst all of the things that we need to undo and rebuild, and we can move forward. And thank you for having me and for this lovely discussion. I could keep talking to all of you for much longer than this, but I will let you go back to your, to your homes and families.
Tani, you know, it'll be me that'll come and find you, or Wendy, or we'll come and find you when we have perhaps even our next book, which we'll have to discuss what we're going to do. I just wanted to say special thanks, Tani. What a great discussion. What a great book. This Sunday, Ben Wolf, who was Arnold Jacob Wolf's son, is going to talk about his work at the ACLU and how Judaism affected it. So, you know, we continue to talk about American civil liberties, and it's great to see everyone this evening. And if you have any questions, you know where to get a hold of me. And thanks, everyone. Wendy, any other closing?
Yeah, just quickly, this Friday at Shabbat services, we have Yolanda Savage-Narva, who is the Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Director for the URJ. Will be doing the Devar. She'll be Zooming in. But in honor of Black History Month, she's agreed to join us. So that's a must not miss. So hope to see you there.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
And Diane, you can zoom in.
I will.
Okay.
Definitely.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye,
Thank
Wendy.
you, Tani. Thank you.
Thank
Great,
you.
great seeing you.
Wonderful seeing all of you.
Yeah,
Thank
it was
you
wonderful.
so much.
Wonderful.